We've got Ralph Darlington, who is the Emeritus Professor of Employment Relations at Salford University. Ralph Darlington has actually written a book recently on the Labour Revolt that occurred 1910 to 14 in Britain. And I had no idea about this until I saw his video, and which Ken Syme passed on to me. But it's a really exciting time in labour relations in Great Britain. So I'm very excited to hear Ralph talk about this topic, and I'm sure all of us will find it very interesting and enjoyable. So I'm going to now hand over to Ralph.
Okay, thanks, Carol. What I want to start by saying is the so-called labour unrest, or what I think more accurately should be described as the Labour Revolt, that swept Britain in the years leading up to the First World War, 1910 to 1914. I want to argue was one of the most sustained, dramatic and violent explosions of industrial militancy that Britain has ever witnessed. After a relative strike quiescence lasting about 20 years, there was a sudden and unanticipated eruption that really dwarfed that of the new unionist strike wave of the late 1880s. And rather ironically, by the time that Robert Tressel's celebrated classic novel, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, had been published in 1914, 3 years after the death of its author, its depiction of exploited but fairly apathetic workers in the face of basic socialist arguments, I think had been superseded by the actuality of an explosion of working class self-activity and self-organisation. And of course, this was to be a strike wave which involved a number of very large national strikes in strategically important areas of the economy, seamen, dockers, transport workers, railway workers, engineering workers, building workers, miners. Many, many different industries were involved. And it embraced not only workers who were members of trade unions, but actually many workers who were not. And significantly, it was to see a dramatic shift in the balance of power away from employers towards workers, an absolutely enormous increase in the level of trade union membership in Britain, the beginnings of the restructuring of trade union organisation, and also a political generalisation from which the radical left was to play, I think, a significant role. And all I can do, in the time I've got, is give you a sort of a flavour for some of the themes which I explore in the book. And the obvious starting point is that a key characteristic of this revolt was its predominantly unofficial character. The fact that action often took place independently of national union officials whose perceived unresponsiveness to workers' grievances, their advocacy of moderation and compromise was often rejected by workers in favour of militant organisation and action from below. And indeed, what most disturbed employers was the inability of national union officials to channel workers' grievances into the established mechanisms of collective bargaining and conciliation machinery. And it led one of the government's leading industrial relations advisor, a guy called George Asquith, who wrote a series of cabinet papers which are looked at the National Archives, to warn that the older generation of conciliatory trade union leaders could no longer maintain their authority. And he said, and I quote, "Often there was more difference between the men and their leaders than between the latter and the employers." And here you see direct action. In other words, the idea that rather than looking somewhere else for workers to solve their grievances, they had to take action through strikes in the workplace themselves. This becomes the gospel of the day. And it's reflected in a belligerent working class self-confidence, a vibrant strike movement in which, although strikes are focused around the issues of wages and conditions and often the rights of collective union organisation, they clearly reflect much broader underlying concerns to do with dignity and self-respect and self-control over aspects of the working lives. And I think it was a spirit of revolt which was captured beautifully by the Irish Transport and General Workers Union leader Jim Larkin, when he said, and I quote, "Labour has lost its old humility and its respectful finger touching its cap." And crucially, what you see is the realization that it's strike action that can actually win major concessions from employers and governments has a demonstration effect, which spreads right across industry and encourages strikes as a key weapon. And what you see is what I describe in the book as a sort of virtuous circle between strike mobilization, leading to tangible material gains, leading to a massive influx of new workers into trade unions during the 4.5-year period involved here, an increase by no less than 62%, and a massive revitalization of trade union activity and organisation. Another feature which I look at is obviously the interplay, the tension between rank and file workers and national trade union officials. And this is because, of course, on the one hand, many national leaders were emphatically opposed to strike action by members in their own unions, and they did what they could to stymie this. And they were opposed to militant strike action because they saw that as threatening their ability to try to forge stable, conciliatory, bargaining relations with employers and with government. And they hoped that by trying to keep that sort of a relationship, they would be more likely to receive some crumbs from the table. In fact, the inability, the failure of such a strategy over the years was what helps in part to explain the sheer scale of the rank and file insurgency which takes place. And indeed, it's this rank and file pressure which then, as in turn, forces many of these national union leaders, more conciliatory, more moderate union leaders often, in order to try to retain any respect or credibility amongst they have members, to actually support strikes and sometimes, on occasion, organise official national strikes themselves. And this is important because it then thereby broadens considerably the extent of mobilisation that might otherwise have taken place. But often what happens is that these national union officials then seek to reassert control and to secure compromise deals with employers and government, which fall far short of members' original demands and expectations. They often attempt to foist rotten deals over the heads of union members and so on, acting as a sort of brake on the militant momentum from below. And I think you see, of course, this isn't true of all national officials. People like Ben Tillett of the Dockers. There's a number of officials in some of the smaller unions who I think probably more accurately could be described as trade union organisers, who, because they're closer to the members, tend to be more sympathetic and therefore more supportive of strikes. But generally, the role of national officials is a form of constraint. And I think you see this in what was known as the Triple Alliance. This is when pressure from below in the three main industries of the period, amongst the miners, the railmen and the transport workers, a pressure on national leaders to form this Triple Alliance. And it opened up the possibility of coordinated strike action embracing 1.5 million affiliated union members, and therefore opening up the possibility of much broader forms of strike action. Of course, in reality, though, for many of the national officials involved, the Triple Alliance was not seen as a means of organising coordinated strike action, let alone a revolutionary weapon to overthrow capitalism in the way in which the revolutionary syndicalists advocated, but merely a form of leverage to try to encourage employers and government to make some concessions without the need for any form of strike action. And this is indeed what took place. Another very novel characteristic feature of the revolt, which I try to draw out, is the extent of solidarity action. The way that significant sections of workers who were not involved in dispute themselves nonetheless took sympathetic action in support of those who were. And this was partly to refuse to touch so-called tainted goods, those goods which had been handled by workers who crossed a picket line and had scabbed, or even taking strike action in support of other workers and then pushing in a whole series of demands on their own employers. William Kneller, who was secretary of the Manchester and Salford Trades and Labour Council at the time, said, and I quote, "For the first time in England, the sympathetic strike was evoked on a large scale and effectively used as a weapon of industrial warfare." And indeed, what I argue is that in many respects, it was the fundamental strategic innovation of this period. And you see this reflected, there are numerous examples I use in the book, but one example was 18 different but simultaneous strikes were taking place in Manchester during 1911. And the ubiquitous George Asquith had to rush up from London, ensconce himself in Manchester Town Hall for 5 days and 5 nights, desperately trying to negotiate with 18 different groups of workers who were in different trades, in different trade unions, in order to try to get settlements. But all of the workers had pledged to each other not to return to work until all of them had won a satisfactory agreement. And therefore, widespread solidarity, broadening day-to-day struggles against individual employers into a struggle against employers in general. Beyond this amazing level of solidarity in support of the Dublin lockout of 1913, in terms of finance, in terms of material aid, 2 bouts of unofficial strike action by railmen in support of the Dublin workers. You see remarkable levels of occupational unity during the Liverpool General Transport strike of 1911. 6,000 different workers in many different trades, incredible degree of support for each other, the partial suspension of religious hostility between Catholic and Protestant workers in a city which, of course, was marked by its sectarian divide. And more broadly, you see the appeal during this period of industrial unionism, the way in which activists in many unions fighting inside their organisations tried to overcome the inherent sectionalism and fragmentation of the existing structures of unionism, essentially craft-based, into more industrial forms of organisation. And one of the successes of this was to lead to the single industrial union, the National Union of Railmen, which of course is the forerunner of today's RMT union. Beyond this, I also look at the role of women workers, because although they only formed a small minority of the workers who were involved in strike action during this period, it seems to me they played a very, very important role in numerous different disputes. And I spent a lot of time looking at this. Young women, young girls, often very much at the driving force of these strikes in both unionised, but also predominantly non-unionised arenas. And here, what you see is the role of the National Federation of Women Workers, an all-female trade union headed by an organiser, Mary MacArthur, played a very important role. And I tried to draw out that integral to its relative success in spectacularly growing its union membership during the period is the sort of the evangelical style of trade unionism it adopts, which effectively uses strikes as the key weapon to build collective organisation. And when I looked at the union's record during the period, it's essentially one of going from one strike to another. The jute workers in Dundee, the chain makers in Cradley Heath in the Midlands, the 15,000 women in 20 different factories in Bermondsey and South East London who went on a strike. And overall, as a consequence of women's involvement in strike activity during this period, you see the extension of union organisation among women by no less than 54%. Really laying the basis for the permanent entry of women into trade unionism for the first time ever beyond its previous enclave of textile industry. Beyond that, I also look at the way in which many women strikers appear to have been emboldened, not only by the militancy of their male counterparts, but also by the militant women's suffrage movement of the day, which of course was fighting the Liberal government for the right to the vote. And here, unquestionably, the role of the suffragettes, whose advocacy of militant civil disobedience, of so-called deeds, not words, which led them to, literally physically attack Liberal government ministers in the street, blow up letterboxes, have arson attempts in buildings across the country, and so on and so forth. You see, as a consequence of this, I think an overall weakening of traditional respect for so-called law and order and constitutional behaviour, which characterises not only the militancy of the suffrage movement, but also of the workers' movement of the day. And here you see this reflected, I think, in many women workers' strikes, which are very assertive, very aggressive, and often quite violent, using mass picketing to extend the strike from one place to another, to attack strike breakers in the street, and so on and so forth. And I also looked at the way in which many women who were not workers, but were the wives or sisters or girlfriends or whatever of male strikers, miners and dockers and so on, were involved in their hundreds and hundreds, again and again and again, in numerous places across the country, in supporting strikes. And not only supporting them in terms of raising money and raising, food and so on and so forth, but supporting them in terms of joining them on the picket line, being involved in attacks on strike breakers, being involved in confrontations with the police and the military. And occasionally the link between the Labour and the suffrage revolt, I think you see quite explicitly. In 1912, a strike in the Gundy's net and rope factory in Bridport in Dorset, the women strikers marched across the town singing the suffragette anthem, shoulder to shoulder. Likewise, in Southwark Park in southeast London, a huge rally in support of the Bermondsey strikers. One of the platform speakers, Charlotte Despard, gets up to speak. She's a well-known suffrage activist, but had been involved in supporting the strike. She's greeted with rapturous cries of good old suffragette. And of course, it's from within the suffragette movement that a small minority, primarily focused around the activities of Sylvia Pankhurst in the East End of London, who fight to argue the battle for women's right to the vote has to be extended into broader social and class issues, and indeed support for workers' struggles. And of course, her East London Federation really successfully integrates into its organisation much broader issues and is very, very supportive of a whole number of different strikes. And in a sense, what Sylvia does is challenge not only those in the suffragette leadership, notably her mother and her sister, who wanted to keep women's issues somehow separate, the issue of suffrage somehow separate. She also challenges those in the Labour and the Socialist movement who had been very dismissive of the suffrage movement and generally fairly, often ignoring questions to do with women's oppression. I also look, there's a separate chapter on counter mobilisation in terms of the employers and the government. And, I don't have time to give the nuances which I try to explore in the book, but essentially employers repeatedly adopt a very obdurate stance, refusing to compromise, trying to even starve workers into submission by forcing long strikes, locking out workers, many, many thousands of workers in an attempt to break strikes, encouraging their own workers to cross a picket line, encouraging workers from all across the country to come down and take over strikers' jobs and then demanding police protection for them. Likewise, you see the government, often confronted with strikes which challenge their authority, adopt a very, very hardline stance, repeatedly agreeing to the deployment of large detachments of police, hundreds and hundreds of police being dispatched into a strike-bound area to buttress the local police forces, and on many occasions also sending in the military, sending in troops to join with the police. And the combination of these two, acting to try to assist so-called blacklegs or scabs getting into the strike, to counteract the workers picketing, to try to pull the rug from underneath strikes. And of course, it's this highly provocative behaviour which inevitably leads to repeated outbursts of dramatic confrontation and indeed street rioting on occasion, with hundreds and hundreds of arrests and prosecutions, with numerous casualties and on occasion fatalities. By way of example, when the South Wales miners' mass picketing is thwarted, there's rioting in the town of Tonypandy, and this leads to one of the strikers being bludgeoned to death by a police baton over the head. During the transport strikes, numerous confrontations in the waterfronts right across Britain. In the Liverpool General Transport strike, Royal Navy gunboat positioned on the Mersey with its guns trained on the strikers. A demonstration of 80,000 is attacked by mounted police with batons that hospitalised 350. When rioting occurs over the next 48 hours, 2 workers are shot dead by the military. And in the National Railway strike of 1911, no less than 50,000 troops were sent to all the strategic railway centres. And in the town of Llanelli in South Wales, when workers attempted to stop the movement of a scab train on the tracks, again, 2 workers are shot dead by the military. Now, beyond this, what I look at is the way also which the Labour Revolt, I think, contributes to a widespread questioning of, and in some respects, challenge to the existing political system in Edwardian Britain. Now, here I don't actually buy the argument of George Dangerfield, whose otherwise magnificent book, The Strange Death of Liberal England, paints a picture of a sort of semi-revolutionary situation. On the other hand, I don't buy either the argument of many industrial relations or labour history academics like Hugh Clegg and Henry Pelling and so on, who sort of argued that, yeah, there was a lot of militancy and violence, but it's essentially confined to a form of trade union consciousness. What I do is try to draw out the way in which strikes had much broader social and economic and political concerns beyond the immediate demands, and that often, because when workers went into dispute, they were confronted with intransigent employers, hesitant, if not oppositional, union officials, the defiance of the government, the violence of the police and the military, and so on. You see a sharp political polarization occur between workers and employers, government, and the state apparatus. And meanwhile, of course, many workers have become disaffected with parliamentary politics, caused by the functioning of the newly formed Labour Party in the House of Commons, operating effectively as an adjunct to the Liberal government of the day, and whose preoccupation with notions of reform from above and electoral concerns mean that at best the Labour Party is irrelevant to the strike wave, and at its worst openly antagonistic to militant trade unionism. And as a result, therefore, the established, if you like, rules of the game, piecemeal social reform by means either of institutionalized collective bargaining through the channel of the trade unions negotiated by officials on the one hand, or change through Parliament through the channel of the Labour Party by MPs on the other, is really put under considerable strain. And instead, what you see is the appeal of combative industrial struggle at the workplace to advance labour movements' interests. And it encourages, therefore, I think, a process of radicalisation, a counter politics, which stands for the celebration of class solidarity and of militant action to defeat the employers and the government. And of course, as I've intimated, this is a workers' rebellion which takes place within the much broader context of the suffrage revolt and also of the fight, the battle for Irish independence from British imperialism and the threat of a reactionary counter-mobilisation in the face of civil war and so on, in the face of an attempt to introduce a Home Rule Bill. This, in other words, creates a much wider challenge to the political system in Edwardian Britain at this time. And therefore, I think it's a revolt which, although not revolutionary, nonetheless contains elements within it which are capable of developing into a coherent challenge to the whole nature of the system. And here, I think, in significant ways, workers' readiness to engage in strike activity is, if you look at what stimulates this, and I have a whole chapter on this in terms of looking at economic and industrial triggers, the political context, and so on and so forth. Beyond this, though, it seems to me that action often critically depends upon the encouragement that workers receive from thousands of workplace union activists and militants within their own ranks. In identifying and articulating and stimulating workers' growing sense of grievance, in advocating militant forms of struggle as being legitimate and an effective means of redress, in assuming leadership roles, in generalising from workers' specific economic grievances to broader class-wide and more political concerns. And here, therefore, seemed to me that although they only formed a small minority of the labour movement, the ideological and organisational influence of the radical left during a time when the Labour Party is a relatively marginal force seems to me to have been particularly significant. And here I don't just mean the Tom Mann or the Jim Larkins of the world. I'm talking about thousands of workplace union activists that were involved in the amalgamation committee movement in numerous different unions and industries, members of the Independent Labour Party on the left wing, members of one of the two Marxist organisations of the day, the Social Democratic Federation, or British Socialist Party as it became, and the Socialist Labour Party, supporters of Tom Mann's Industrial Syndicalist Education League, members of the independent socialist societies, of the Plebs League that advocated independent working class political education and so on, readers of the two mass weekly newspapers of the day, the Clarion and the Daily Herald. Probably about 50,000 active socialists who are involved in supporting the strikes, involved in a number of cases in leading strikes. Seems to me they provide an intensely ideological and political cutting edge to workers' militancy during the period. Well, finally, of course, the forward momentum of this working class revolt, let alone any revolutionary outcome, is to be seriously undermined by a whole series of limitations and weaknesses. And again, I explore this in rather more detail in the book, but what I can do here is just flag up some of what these were. Clearly, there are some serious setbacks and reverses. Terrible defeat of the London transport strike of 1912 and of the Dublin lockout of 1913, for example. There's the way in which, as I've said, although this was a rank and file insurgency driven from below, again and again, national union officials were able ultimately to reassert control, and this was to have detrimental consequences in a whole number of cases. Relatedly, there was the relative weakness of rank and file organisation, because of those tremendous grassroots militancy, and there was forms of rank and file organisation, the degree of inter-union, inter-industry organisation was at a relatively embryonic stage. And it wasn't until the First World War, the development of a national shop stewards movement, that you begin to see workplace-based forms of organisation which are have capacity not only to put pressure on union officials, but actually to take action independently of them. There are continuing gender divisions during the period, so that although women workers are winning significant increases in pay, they're still paid considerably less than men for comparable work. And even the much celebrated industrial union, the National Union of Railmen, as its name suggests, actually excluded women, despite the fact that 15,000 worked in the industry. There's the way that the Liberal government are able to accommodate the three simultaneous revolts: the Workers' Revolt, Suffrage Revolt, and the Irish Revolt. And although there are some interconnections between these, what I explore is that there's a huge and frustrating gulf between them, and therefore they remain effectively coexist side by side on parallel tracks, and this really undermines their potential united power. There's also the political and strategic tactical limitations of the radical left, and the most notable problem here is the sharp separation which is often made between those activists who put all the emphasis on industrial struggle, on workers' economic battles in the workplace on the one hand, and those who advocate political organisation, political ideas and action on the other. And although there are some individuals who try to fuse these, again, it's not until the First World War period and then immediately afterwards, in 1920, 1919, 1920, that you see the radical left have a radical reassessment, really, of strategy and tactics, and try to find a solution to this problem in terms of bringing them together. And of course, the strike wave was anyway to shudder dramatically to a halt, stopped in its tracks by the onset of the First World War in August of 1914. Although, in fact, of course, although strikes collapsed literally during this, following this, it didn't take very long, as you'll know, for strikes to reappear. By 1917, 200,000 engineering workers were going on strike. By 1919, 1920, absolutely massive explosion, a new workers' revolt, which in fact actually dwarfed that of the Labour Revolt of 1910 to 1914. Very finally, in the last minute or so, let me say, in terms of, obviously this is interesting in its own right, but you'll be cognizant of the way in which some of the things which are thrown up have some contemporary echoes. Of course, there are considerable differences from 1910, 1914 to the strikes which we've seen in Britain over the last year or so, but there are some themes which seem to me to be of relevance. One, obviously, is the role of trade union officialdom, because what we've seen over the last year or so is a tendency for, in a number of the cases, for officials to to avoid militant confrontation, to organise strikes which have a sort of intermittent stop-start nature, but to avoid any open confrontation and so on, to very much restrict them. Willingness to accept compromise deals fall far short of the level of inflation at the moment, and on occasion, as we've seen in the case of the RCN and the UCU, forced deals over the heads of, over union members and so on. there's been the problem of a rank and file disaffection. Of course, workplace union organisation in Britain over the 40 years or so since the 70s and the 80s has been atrophied, has weakened. The level of independence from trade union officials is considerably less than it used to be. But what we have seen is in a number of workplaces and unions is growing rank and file disaffection with the role of officials and the way in which strikes have been compromised and ended. And we saw that, for example, in the revolt that took place inside the RCN, again inside the UCU, and a significant minority inside the CWU, and at the moment an attempt inside the NEU to organise resistance to a deal which is being advocated. I think there's relevance in terms of today to the past in terms of the role of the Labour Party, because of course very few people look towards Keir Starmer's Labour Party to be the fifth cavalry that's going to come to the aid of workers. The fact is Starmer has made it absolutely clear that not only the Labour Party does not support the strikes, is not in favour of inflation busting claims, has forbidden MPs to appear on picket lines and so on and so forth, and in many respects, therefore, rather than workers looking towards the Labour Party as an aid to their struggles, often see the relevance of direct action of extra parliamentary forms of activity from below as being the most important factors here. I think the Labour Revolt, the strike wave of the last year or so has also underlined the relevance of class politics in the way in which the 1910 to 1914 period has done. The way in which workers, it was clear during the period of the pandemic, but as a consequence of this level of strike activity over recent months, you see the way in which workers are absolutely central to the functioning of a society. When as socialists have often advocated, actually workers are the central agency of change, not only in the here and now for better terms and conditions, but also ultimately for a different form of society. And finally, I think the strikes over the last few months have also underlined the need for socialist organisation, because socialist organisation which can link militants and activists from one union, one industry to another, that can create the forms of grassroots organisation which can counter the arguments of those inside the Labour Party and trade union leadership, a socialist organisation that can actually relate industrial workers' struggles to broader political concerns, whether that be to do with opposing racism, supporting migrant workers, opposing the whole question, raising the whole questions of climate change and so on and so forth. So the relevance of socialist politics, I think, is fairly clear. So I'm sorry if I've gone over a bit of time there, but I'll leave it at that.
That was absolutely fascinating. I had no idea. Well, actually, what comes to my mind is Tony Benn's statement, every generation has to fight the same battles. It sounded so like what's going on today to me. The parallels were very, very obvious. I've got two hands up already, so I'm going to bring in Larry and then Mike. If anybody else would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please put your electronic hand up so that I can see it, and I'll bring you in. So first of all, Larry, and then Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ralph. Excellent contribution. The only thing I missed at the beginning, I couldn't get into the meeting quick enough, was the title of your book. But anyway, what concerned me originally was that in the first part that I came into was the fact of unofficial and unpredictable. They were the two words that you said at the start, that I felt that there must be more to it than that. There's got to be a network somewhere involved. Workers then and today are failing in network organisation. And one of the points that you made, and I made a note of it, was the community dignity. Now, communities are lacking dignity today, in as much as that we have food banks on every bloody corner almost, but there's no militancy about where that food's coming from. I believe the food banks have been initiated to stop people going to the supermarkets and helping themselves. Why do workers always seek leadership and not control their own destiny. These are the points that I've since becoming involved with Republican Labour group in education forum, is that trying to understand that workers need to understand that democracy and accountability is a cornerstone for any way forward. The fact that we end up with an MP in the House of Commons, you know, every 5 years, they seem to think is democracy. And one of the points you made is about the leadership of trade unions post-war, 1945, and a bit before, was that there's an element of Stalinism there that allows the CP to get involved in trade unions and take over the control of trade unions and determine the future of any strikes. And when I was involved with the print union, we had 13 branches in London alone within the print organisation, and I campaigned for amalgamation to become a stronger union, but that has failed to materialise. The print unions have actually disappeared into Unite, and I don't think they even exist now as an organisation. And the anti-trade union legislation, which is embraced by the leadership of the trade unions, it goes unchallenged. And I think those are the points that I want to try and raise and give. I know you mentioned about the period of 1910 to 1914, but as Carol rightly outlined, it all has a contemporary feel about it. One of the worst organised strikes that I was involved with, and that was the News International dispute for over a year. We went on strike as workers, but we had no idea or a strategy to win that strike, other than going down and standing on some highway somewhere. There was no strategy to involve other workers in the print industry other than a boycott, which was absolutely useless. And the rank and file organisations that we tried to develop were scorned upon by the official trade unions and workers. Even you mentioned strike committees today at Trades Council meetings. They have no comprehension of why you're trying to make those points. Trade union strikes at the moment don't seem to have a strategy. There's no strategy to embrace the communities, and there's no strategy to win these strikes. They're just having days off of work. So I'll be interested to know what your book is, Ralph, and have a little look at it. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you very much, Larry. Some very, very important points. Yeah, I think we'll all be. I'm sure we'll all be getting this book because it's obviously a source of a lot of very valuable information for any trade unionist. I'm going to bring, if it's all right with you, Ralph, I'm going to bring Mike and Ian in, and then if you could come back and answer any questions or comment on any contributions that they've made. So I'm going to bring Mike in now. Mike Hope.
Right. Yeah, Ralph. Thanks so much. That I mean, I was aware of the period, and things like Tonopandi had lodged themselves in my memory, but the extent of it and the way you've systematized it is really very important, and like others, I'd really like to get my hands on your book. Some questions to raise. First of all, I mean, in terms of the ruling class response, both by the employers and by government, the willingness to use sort of masses of police and the military. Churchill was he not the Home Secretary during this period? And it is he who got a reputation which followed him really until somehow he managed to, by sleight of hand, salvage his reputation 20 years later. He got a reputation as the guy who shot down strikers in South Wales and elsewhere. And, I think we see there the ruthlessness of the ruling class when they really feel that their interests are threatened. And, in the current period, they haven't ever felt the need to sort of bring in troops, though the legislation with regard to the police that's recently been passed is certainly laying the grounds for clearing the streets wherever possible. I just wanted to ask some questions, though, with regard to, you spoke about the Dublin lockout. What was going on in particular, talking of sectarian divisions, as you touched upon in Liverpool, what was going on in Belfast at this time? That's a question for you to answer. And I just go on to make this observation with regard to what was looming on the horizon, which was, of course, the imperialist powers going to war to fight for spheres of influence, resources, etc. And internationally, there had been statements from different socialist groups and trade union groups: we will not support our own ruling class. Well, didn't happen, did it? Not in Germany, not in France, and certainly not in Britain. So I would say the weakness here, you've emphasized some strengths about a sort of intersectionality, the role of women workers at the political edge, but they could not challenge nationalism, the massive jingoism that was drummed up as soon as war was declared. They went, therefore, like lambs to the slaughter, to, as the cannon fodder for the British Empire. And sadly, there was no resistance to that. And it's that ability to confront your own state and actually have more in common with the ordinary workers in the supposed enemy state than that which you have in common with your own bosses. They've been shooting you down, and then you go and fight for them. The pressures on people were enormous, but there was not that spirit of internationalism. And I would argue then and now that is what we need. And without it, sadly, however militant things turn out to be, we are doomed to only go so far.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. Some really, really good observations and questions there. I'm going to bring Ian in now. We've got another hand up, Peter. Can I bring in Ian and Peter, and then answer the questions, Ralph? Is that okay?
Oh yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Ian, I'm going to bring Ian Spencer in now.
Good evening and greetings from sunny Durham. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I'll definitely be buying the book. I just wanted to ask a couple of little practical questions. We today tend to think in terms of public sector, private sector, that kind of thing. Of course, it was very different then. However, there was a kind of public sector in one sense, because the Asylum Workers Union was on strike in 1910. Did you come across any kind of distinction that was drawn between, say, the Poor Law Officers Association, the Asylum Workers Union, and the more established industrial unions? And the other thing was about the implosion of the Social Democratic Federation and what came out of it subsequently. How much of the uprising that was taking place informed the formation of those parties? And of course, I've just mentioned in passing that the Sylvia Pankhurst's paper, Women's Dreadnought, became Workers' Dreadnought in 1914. How much impact did Sylvia Pankhurst have at the time in terms of her own political organisation? And there was a Socialist Unity Conference, wasn't there, in 1911 after the implosion of the Social Democratic Federation. What kind of impact did this sort of rising tide of class consciousness have on that conference? Have you any particular intelligence on that? Thanks very much. A fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian.
You know, if you buy basically, you know, any major sort of British Labour history text, it refers to this period as the Labour unrest. That's the term which is conventionally used, and what I sort of argue in the book is that I think that term is inadequate because it sort of suggests a relatively unproblematic and temporary challenge to what is a normally peaceful and stable society, whereas in fact, you know, as I have tried to point out, really we're talking about a period that was characterised by its rank and file insurgency, by its defiance of labour movement leaders, by its high level of solidarity action, by its unofficial sort of nature, by its social confrontations on the streets, and by its industrial and political challenge to the, you know, to the political system of the day. And in that respect, therefore, I think the term Labour Revolt captures it rather more accurately. I mean, he also mentioned the question of unpredictability and unplanned, and, you know, what about leadership and so on. I mean, I look at this in some length in the book, because although, you know, I mean, funny enough, George Dangerfield in his book, The Strange Death of Liberal England, and quite a lot of commentators, it seems to me, you know, fall into one of two traps. One is to assume that it was just an explosion of unnamed individuals, in which the, you know, a sort of spontaneous sort of generation of militancy. And of course, I don't think that adequately captures what goes on, because even when workers, you know, without any premeditation, decide to walk out and strike, there's always some individuals who are more committed, more conscious of what might need to be done, more determined than others, who take a lead and therefore encourage others to take similar action, and that then can act as, you know, to spread the thing. There's always leadership of some kind, even though it's very difficult to find out who, you know, the names of individuals, and the fact they're not necessarily a member of a party or whatever, nonetheless is of significance. So of course, leadership is crucial to collective mobilization, even in what appears superficially from the outside to be just some sort of spontaneous generation. Conversely, though, much of the press, you know, the Times of the day, the government, many employers and employers associations, even the Labour Party, put the finger on the syndicalists as instigating these strikes. You know, it was strikes that were being manufactured by revolutionaries. This was the sort of claim that was being made. And it seems to me, you know, this really was a gross over-exaggeration. You know, that I don't really buy the agitator theory of strikes, the idea that somehow strikes are manufactured by workers, and that you know, this sort of denies the existence of genuine workers' grievances, which are the key focus for why strikes take place. And although agitators may have some purchase in a strike, they don't actually cause the strike in of itself necessarily. They can give direction to it. They can act, you know, as a catalyst for it to take place. And also, but also, and more importantly, I think, what agitators and leaders and militants and socialists and so on can do, and it seems to me it's clear was taking place during this period, is they play a role in terms of the subsequent conduct of the strike, in terms of the generation of solidarity, in terms of the tactics which are adopted, and so on and so forth. So, you know, leadership is of a significance, I think, within this period. I mean, just by contemporary relevance, you know, I mean, there is the problem at the moment of a weakness of grassroots forms of workplace union organisation, and there's no question that that's the case. And when somebody, I think Larry mentioned the point about strike committees, that when you mention that, people look at you, you know, not even, people have no experience. There's a whole generation when strikes haven't formed a strike committee. Of course, a strike committee is fantastically important because it allows new activists, not just the old, rather beleaguered often, trade union representatives and workplace reps who've held union organisation together for many years, but are often quite passive and pessimistic themselves about the ability of members to take action, having based on experience of how they've been in the past, to miss what's happening, where there's a new dynamic, where new people who you would never have thought would have gone on strike, not only going on strike, but being the ones most active, most passionate, most wanting to take a lead. And therefore a strike committee provides the opportunity to galvanise both of these sorts of constituencies in order to take control of the strike, to be able to discuss strategy and tactics, to give democratic participation, to gain experience in leadership and so on, and therefore in turn to be able to develop ways and means of confronting Labour leaderships and so on. So I think the whole question of strike committees, of mass meetings, and re-establishing what, in the 1970s were fairly ABC mechanisms, the strength of picket lines and so on, not just to stop movement of people in and out or stop movement of goods or acting as a public display, a demonstration of the strike, but to act also as a forum for discussion and debate amongst strikers themselves, to give them the possibility of meeting and overcoming the isolation of individuals in different parts of a workplace and so on. All of this, I think, is fantastically important and was very much to be seen during the period of 1910 to 1914. This is what characterised the strikes. Rank and file insurgency, but lots of rank and file activity and organisation on the ground in this sort of fashion. The question of might raise the question of the ruthlessness of the state and so on. And, this is absolutely the case. And people have pointed out the fact that, there are, although, I'm at pains not to draw the comparison with today too far. I think there are elements which have contemporary relevance, but circumstances are completely different in many, many respects. And, I wouldn't in any way suggest that the level of violence which the state is willing to utilise or is utilising at the moment is of the same order, particularly in the period of the revival of strike activity. It's the first time in 30 years that we've seen over the last few months. But nonetheless, as one or two other people pointed out, the experience of the miners' strike gives you a taste of what that can be. And, we should be under no illusion that the state would be prepared to utilise that type of force again in the event of a real push of insurgency from below. You see a sense of that in what's happened in France in recent weeks, in terms of the strikes and the rioting that took place, the sheer level of violence of the capitalist state. Of course, we've got no illusions in. One thing which, a couple of people raised is the question of the war. And, in the book, I have a final chapter, which is on the sort of denouement, which looks at what happened during the war and immediate after period. And, it's absolutely the case that the strikes in August of 1914, even though 1914, the level of strike activity was continuing to generate, it was still on a very high level. There was lots of expectation that more broader generalised strikes were going to take place, fears by the government and employers that the anticipation this was going to be the case. Alas, was all to end completely abruptly when war was declared. Although there'd been over the looming horizon, the war clouds, no one I don't think had really anticipated it was actually come to that. And so what you see is the level of strikes literally collapses overnight. Overnight, the level of strikes just disappears. And of course, in part, this is to do with the fact that, as one or two people pointed out, the leaders of the labour and the trade union movement unequivocally supported the war effort. Ben Tiller, the radical left-wing sort of leader of the dockers and so on, openly went round campaigning for people to be mobilised and to join the army. The leadership of the Labour Party, the leadership of the TUC and so on, and all individual union leaders pledged themselves to the cessation of conflict in support of the war effort against Germany. So in part, the leaders of the movement played a very influential role in this. But quite frankly, we've got to be honest and say, as one or two people have intimated, that actually workers themselves enthusiastically embraced the war in their hundreds and hundreds of thousands, joining up, thinking that it would be a quick war, that it'd be some sort of an adventure, and so on and so forth. And so this took place, and so the things collapsed. Now, does that mean that the class struggle, that solidarity, that notions of militancy and so on were completely evaporated and extinguished? No, it doesn't. And what I try to explore it's a relatively shorter chapter at the end, is the way in which it seems to me you had a coexistence of, on the one hand, nationalism and patriotism, the idea that Germany was the key enemy, and so on and so forth, that people bought that sort of propaganda and ideology. On the other hand, the same group of workers also retained often ideas about class solidarity, about a class notion of the nature of capitalist society, and so on. These haven't been completely undermined. And as I mentioned, you see in a very short period of time, by February of 1915, there were strikes taking place on the Clyde, among shipyard workers and engineering workers, and the level of strike activity increases as the war period goes along. And you see a combination of disgruntlement and disaffection with the effect of the war, thousands of people being lost on the front, people coming back, the news about what was happening, combined with the privations of the war period, because of course not only are strikes banned, but also there are the employers and the state take advantage of the opportunity to remove established collective agreements and conditions, to worsen, intensify work, and so on. And of course the crucial industry in which this is seen at its sharpest point is in the engineering industry, and that's precisely because engineering was turned en masse towards production, towards output of armaments, and therefore skilled engineering workers become the front line of battling against this and trying to defend some sort of collectivist notions. So the same skilled engineering worker who supports the war effort at the same time is concerned to defend their right to oppose dilution, the way in which the employers are trying to replace their jobs with unskilled labour, and so on and so forth. And you see a contradictory form of consciousness and existence, but strikes begin to develop. And so I think, this is significant, is important, because of course it can then help to explain why come 1918 and the end of the war and into 1919, you see a new explosion, a massive explosion of strikes, which, as I mentioned earlier, completely and utterly dwarfs that of the 1910 to 1914 period. Strikes across numerous industries. You see police strikes, you see army mutinies, you see confrontations in a whole number of areas. Mass disaffection takes place, and as troops come back that have survived, who have been promised a land fit for the future and so on, that realise what the consequence, that actually they're going on to the dole. There aren't jobs for them. They're going back into the horrific housing conditions in which they have endured previously, and so on and so forth. You get this mix of industrial and political militancy takes place, and many historians have referred to 1919 as the year when Britain came nearer to a workers' revolution than any other form of British history. So, you can't explain that if you think that notions of patriotism and nationalism completely and utterly extinguish class notions. I'm not suggesting anyone suggested that in terms of the questions, but I think one needs to take into account of these contradictory pressures. Now that brings me to the Russian Revolution, because again, somebody mentioned, and again, this is covered in this denouement chapter, that what takes place, of course, in 1917 is the Russian Revolution, the influence of the Bolsheviks that attempt to spread revolution through the formation of the Communist International, and to try to knock heads together amongst disparate socialist groups in Britain, as in many other countries across the world, to form new communist parties, is an important development. And it seems to me that this external influence, a living worker state, however that state was to develop and arguably subsequently completely degenerate in a very quick period of time, and so on and so forth. The fact is, it was a promise. It offered a prospect of a new world. It showed the left and many workers that workers could take control of society. It showed new agencies for revolutionary change in the form of a Soviet rather than a trade union in the way that the syndicalists had imagined. It showed the role of a political disciplined, centralized party organization linking to a mass movement and so on. It showed the need for revolution to break the power of the capitalist state. This wasn't going to come through parliament. It was a very, very powerful ideological, political and organizational factor which helped to influence the events of the post-war period and lead to the formation of the British Communist Party of Great Britain. And of course, many of the people that have been involved in the Labour Revolt, J.T. Murphy in Sheffield, Tom Mann, the great legendary strike leader of the period, Harry Pollett, who'd been a boilermaker in Manchester, Alf Purcell, a number, even Sylvia Pankhurst originally, are drawn to the communism, to the Communist International and so on. And of course, there's a radical reassessment of socialist tactics and socialist organization, which helps bring that fusion together. But it seems to me it's not just the external influence of the Russian Revolution, which is crucial, which acts as a catalyst. Also, it's the domestic experience. In other words, workers and activists and socialists themselves who cut their teeth in the period of the 1910 to 1914 revolt in learning strategy and learning about class politics and so on and so forth, and grappling for new ways of taking the movement forward, then go through the experience of the First World War and see the development of the shop stewards movement in engineering, the ability to act independently of the officials and so on and so forth, the analysis of trade union officialdom, which the syndicalists developed. All of this is absolutely crucial as well. And therefore you have this simultaneous domestic sort of series of experiences and influences which underpin the reassessment of the left, then fusing with the external influence of the Russian Revolution. One or two other queries, things I want to say is the role of the left itself. I mean, I've got a whole chapter, a couple of sort of major sections on the left. The Social Democratic Federation, somebody mentioned, quite rightly, they were the main Marxist organization in Britain. They had about 10,000 members. The problem with them, as I'm sure comrades will be familiar, is they're probably characterized by a sort of abstract propagandism in many respects, in terms of the advocacy of political ideas and political organization. But really a dismissal of often of trade unionism as strike activity as being sort of integral to capitalist society and not worth, stepping your toe into the water over. Typified by the leader of the SDF at the time, Henry Heinemann. But what I explore is the way that actually under the impact of the Labour Revolt and the way in which workers go onto the street and take strike action and so on, many members of the Social Democratic Federation are infected by this and see themselves as members of trade unions, become involved in supporting strikes, in some cases lead strikes. And there's an internal debate and argument inside the SDF about whether the role of industrial struggle in terms of the political fight for change and so on. And this leads to a similar sort of fertilization, similar internal sort of revolts going on in a number of different organizations inside the Independent Labour Party, led previously by, set up by Keir Hardie. It's an eclectic mix of different sort of individuals that had notions of parliamentary change from above. On the other hand, under the impact of the Labour Revolt, you see a number of ILP branches, left-wing branches, infected with syndicalist industrial ideas and so on. And in other organisations, you get this as well. And therefore, this is what helps bring together. There's the Unity Conference of 1911, which brings into being a new organisation, the British Socialist Party, a sort of fusion of the SDF with the left-wing members of the ILP, with independent socialist societies, with Clarion groups and so on and so forth. At its peak, initially, it's probably 28,000 members. It offers the prospect of building a radical left which can actually seriously challenge, act as a left-wing pole of attraction outside of the Labour Party. Actually doesn't really rise to the occasion for numerous problems, in part to do with continuing fights inside the organisation over industrial strategy. But it shows nonetheless a layer of militants who come through this. And when you look at some of the individuals involved, the Willie Gallaghers, the Tom Bells, people, leading figures on Clydeside involved in these organisations, of course, John what's his name? John McLean in Scotland and so on, a leading SDF member. Ben Tillett was a member of the SDF. Tom Mann, even though he was a syndicalist, joined the SDF. Leading sort of figures nonetheless play this role. And so you see the possibility of socialist organisations. But in the period, as I say, after the war, you get this fusion of the British Socialist Party with the Socialist Labour Party, which adopted did put the emphasis on revolutionary unionism and industrial organisation, but was a highly sectarian organisation insofar as it advocated, rather than the syndicalist strategy of boring from within the existing union organisations in order to attempt to get them to fuse and amalgamate and be infected with the revolutionary ideas. The SLP advocated new pure revolutionary unions outside the existing union movement. And whilst that had some success in the huge Singer sewing machine factory on the Clydebank, probably the largest factory in Britain at the time, in the strike which took place there in 1911, it was really a sectarian non-starter as a strategy anywhere else. But nonetheless, their advocacy of industrial unionism, of militancy, of strikes and so on, was highly influential, intellectually and ideologically was highly influential for a whole layer of militants around the Plebs League and so on and so forth. So, the left, although it's separated to different organizations, and although it takes time, and this undermines the potential for more effective socialist leadership in the period of 1910 to 1914, the left does nonetheless play a very important role, and it's one which it seems to me lots of historians have been too willing to dismiss and not recognise. Is there anything else? Finally, on the question, I think Peter raised the question of the strike strategies of which we've seen over the last few months. Now here, I think the RMT and ASLEF are slightly different in some respects, and in the way that Peter sort of flagged up. But I mean, in a sense, these are our industries and our unions that, in a sense, have the elbow room to be able to call this intermittent action or an overtime ban and still have a dramatic effect insofar as it stops the trains. In other words, they're in a strategically very central industry with tremendous power, industrial power. But of course, teachers or civil servants or nurses or Amazon workers or whatever like this don't quite have that same power, industrial power today, as in the past. They're much more dependent in terms of trying to build, put more political pressure on the government through the extent of their action as much as they are in terms of what strength they may have in the workplace. And here, therefore, I do think that there's been a problem with the strategy, which has been, because I think there is a strategy. It's been a strategy which has predominated in varying ways, but essentially one that the union officialdom writ large have advocated, which is wary of engaging a confrontation with the government, lacking faith in members, thinking that by having stop-start intermittent strike action, hopefully this would lead to some success. And I think we've got to say, in truth, it's not led to success, because quite frankly, although there have been some strike successes, usually, Unite's been involved, local strikes in particular places, on a national level, we've not actually seen one real significant victory. You know, and I don't think that the Communication Workers Union deal, which has just been signed, is a victory by any means. I don't think that the deal which has been advocated in the National Education Union is a victory by any means in terms of the pressure. And I think the problem has been the lack of rank and file organisation, because of the atrophy we've talked about in the past, has meant that, you know, really socialists are having to sort of, if you like, blow on the flame, the ember of discontent, to try to create and encourage some mechanisms, rank and file networks of resistance inside individual unions and on an inter-industry, inter-union basis. But it's all at a very embryonic stage to talk about alternative strategies. And of course, the obvious alternative strategy, particularly when you have postal ballots, strike ballots, which under the government's restrictive union legislation requires a repeat ballots after every 6 months, means that actually, you know, the problem is for unions is if you continue to have one-day strikes every now and again, or in the case of some of the unions, you know, they have a couple of strikes and then there's no strikes for months afterwards, is that the strategy is one which goes on for months and months and months without any sign of a victory. And I think, and moreover, then unions have to become preoccupied with trying to win the next ballot. And although they've been quite successful in winning initial ballots, trying to win repeat ballots, putting all the emphasis on trying to reach the hurdle that the Tories arbitrarily decide, I think becomes a diversion from what actually might be taking place if they were to front load the action, to take more decisive action. Now in 1910 to 1914, it was indefinite action. You walked, and this was the case in the 1970s, as I'm sure comrades will remember. When people went out on strike, you went out on strike and you stayed out on strike until you won or you lost, or you got some sort of the deal. But I mean, you know, you front loaded the strike. Now, I'm not, you know, that may be a step too far in today's conditions in some unions and some industries, but it's not out of the question to front load in terms of much more, you know, rather than a 1 day and then 6 weeks later, maybe another strike, to have, you know, 2 weeks of strike action. Now, you know, I know the argument against that it means that people lose pay and so on. Many unions, though, have war chests in terms of strike pay. I don't think, you know, workers, you know, I think it's wrong for socialists to put the emphasis on workers always receiving, you know, obviously strike pay is only a fraction of what they may lose, but sometimes people have to forfeit in the short term in order to win better in the longer term. And it seems to me if there'd been a rather more aggressive, rather more militant strategy being adopted over the previous few months, we would have seen some victories, rather than strikes which are being extended over such long period in which really they haven't been successful. Strikes are important, but a strike victory is even more important because it acts as a demonstration. It shows it can be done. And to the extent that this, you know, becomes effective, then I think, you know, this is really important. I mean, you know, I accept that the movement at the moment is very much at a low ebb. I mean, I you know, final point I'm going to say is that I taught and researched I'm retired now in university for 30 years. And I had to fight a sort of rearguard action in my institution because people would say to me, well, you know, surely industrial relations, trade unionism, strikes, you know, what's that? Why is that of any relevance to Britain in the 21st century and the new world of human resource management and so on and so forth? And I had to argue, no, actually, these things were still relevant and important. And I even edited a book called What's the Point of Industrial Relations in Defense of Critical Social Science? And, you know, lo and behold, I then retire and all of a sudden you got this revival of strike activity, which I'm absolutely delighted for as a socialist, but also because it helps underline, you know, the significance of my book in 1910 to 1914. But also, I think it shows that actually the strikes have been very important, but we're starting from a low ebb, and there's a lot of lessons have to be relearned And we can't expect that people know what a strike committee is, let alone know how to set it up and what it does. These are things which have to be relearned. But it's in struggle that workers can relearn them and develop new and innovative forms of organisation. So I think, we have to be recognising the difficulties and constraints at the moment, but do everything we can to try to encourage that process so that there are some victories and so that we build better and stronger organisation for the battles which are yet to come.